Celui, celle, ce, celle, celui-là, celui-ci, celle-ci, celle-ci, cela, ceci. They mean the one, the ones, these ones, that one, those ones, this one, and even that. They confuse, quite understandably, a lot of English speakers studying the language, including me for quite a while, but now that I've pretty much figured out what they all mean and how and when to use them in everyday life, I thought it was time to put them into a video. And thank you to Coco, who over on Instagram generated the idea for this video with her question. I've broken the video down into the following chapters. First, the meanings and uses of celui, celle, ce, and celle with an S, and their equivalents in English. Then we'll build on top of that to understand what changes with the addition of those crafty suffixes ci and la. And then I will tell you, with the benefit of my years in France, where French diverges from English and which words to actually use to sound like a native most of the time. Stick around until the end because you can know the rules, but true masters know when to bend them. And also, I'm going to give you un petit quiz so you can put your new knowledge into practice tout de suite. Du coup, si vous êtes prêts, allez, c'est parti. Alors, the very first important thing to note is that celui, celle, ce, and celle with an S are all pronouns. They are very handy words to replace nouns, and the goal is to avoid repeating things and keep messages as concise as possible. The French ones function very much the same as the English. Consider the following example of a question and an answer. Alors, chérie, tu veux quel ballon? Celui de gauche. Celui de gauche. So instead of repeating ballon by saying le ballon de gauche, he said celui de gauche. In English, this would be the left one. It's exactly the same for celle. The only difference between celui and celle is that celui is used for masculine nouns and celle for feminine nouns. Et maman, on prend quelle voiture pour rentrer à la maison? Celle de papa. Celle de papa. In English, we can get away with saying dad's, but I think dad's one is okay too, and actually this is a closer translation to the French one. The one of dad is even closer, but we definitely wouldn't say that in English, would we? The one of dad. Dad's car. In French, when showing possession, it's thing plus de plus the person, and that is the logic we use with celui and celle. Because remember, pronoun is just a word that replaces a noun. So that's the first use of celui and celle, to mean the one. The second fulfills the same job, but translates better to that of in English. Look at this example to see what I mean. Ils envisagent leur avenir et celui de leurs enfants. Ils envisagent leur avenir et celui de leurs enfants. They are contemplating their future and that of their children. As an English speaker, you know that you can also say they are contemplating their future and their children's. And you would use the context to decide which version fit better, right? You would just feel it. In French, you just have the one option. So, what does celui represent in that sentence? Well, it represents the noun l'avenir, l'avenir. And without me even telling you what gender l'avenir has, you can figure out it's masculine because you know celui represents masculine nouns. And this is actually one way to start to just know the genders of nouns without thinking, from picking up patterns in sentences. I know many of you are curious to know, how do you just know the gender of things? That's just one way. Now here's an example of celle with the same meaning of that of. Ils organisent leur soirée et celle de leurs enfants. Ils organisent leur soirée et celle de leurs enfants. They are organising their evening and that of their kids or children. Alternatively, they are organising their evening and their kids or children's. But I encourage you to remember the first structure because it's closer to the French in terms of word order. So I do hope that's clear. So to summarise, celui and celle can mean the one and that of, depending on the sentence. Now, when it comes to ce and celle, the only difference is that the nouns that they replace are plurals. When at least one of the nouns in the group is masculine, we choose ce. And when all in the group are feminine, we use celle. just like we do when we choose between il and elle, the subject pronouns. It's even easier with CEUX and CELLE because most of the time, if not every time, the groups we're talking about are groups of the same thing. By the way, CELLE is pronounced the same as CELLE since the S is silent. So here's an example of CEUX and CELLE plural. Elle m'a parlé de ses projets et de ceux de son mari. Elle m'a parlé de ses projets et de ceux de son mari. She spoke to me about her plans and those of her husband. The noun projet is plural and projet is masculine, so we use ce. Contrast that with the following example. Elle m'a parlé de toutes ses plantes et de celles de son mari. Elle m'a parlé de toutes ses plantes et de celles de son mari. She spoke to me about all her plants and those of her husband. Les plantes is a plural of a feminine noun, la plante, and so when choosing a pronoun, we use celle with an S. So it means those of. So ce and celle with an S mean the ones or those of, depending on the sentence. So now that you understand the fundamentals of celui, celle, ce, and celle with an S, let's move on to those forms where the suffixes ci and la are added. So imagine for this one you're at the bakery and you ask for une baguette. The member of staff offers you two because their niveau de cuisson or how baked they are different. He might say celle-ci ou celle-là as a question, gesturing with each hand as he does so. In this case, because you can simply point and specify which one, you're going to use the same wording he used. You can probably see right away that celle-ci and celle-là translate to this one and that one. In this example, why do you think we use celle and not celui? That's right, because une baguette is feminine, so we end up using the feminine singular form, which is celle. If it were a simple loaf of bread, it'd just be un pain. Un pain. And so the question or response would be celui-ci or celui-là. Celui-ci ou celui-là. Again, it's this one or that one in English. Now, something important to talk about is choosing between ci and la. Well, in the case of our example with the baker, you can just repeat back the version that you heard. If he says celui-ci for the one in his left hand, or camera, yeah, left hand. If he says celui-ci for the one in his left hand and celui-là for the one in his right, if you're lucky enough to have it so explicit, you can respond with celui-ci if you want the one in his left. Often, unfortunately, but that's life, the choices are not so explicit. And so it has evolved such that ci is to be used for something that is closer than the other option or options, either physically closer or closer in terms of time, i.e. it was more recently referred to than the other or others. And therefore what's left? Well, it's things that are further away, either in time or physical distance. For example, in preparation for this video, I asked CFSC teacher and native speaker Joania to check one of the example sentences. Once she'd done that, I followed up with an alternative. And because that alternative was the latest example sentence in our discussion, it was the most recent, I used celle-ci when introducing it. I said, et celle-ci, elle passe aussi? Ou sont-elles bizarres? So I was saying, and this one, does it work as well? Is it okay to use as well? Or does it sound weird? And then I gave the sentence, et maman, on prend quelle voiture pour rentrer à la maison? And she responded, oui. Celle-ci est correcte. I could then refer to the previous sentences or sentence with la, celle-là. Now the only extra thing to talk about is the gender. If you don't know the gender, honestly, just guess. If you're in that real world environment, you've just got to say something, you have to choose, just guess. Look it up later, as you're already doing probably with the gender of other things when you're talking about le and la or un or une. Just look it up later. I know we hear stories and memes of French people getting all upset and snobby about word gender when foreigners make a mistake, but that's not been my experience. If you smile, you're polite, you'll more often than not come across a nice, friendly person. Sometimes I even ask before I order. Once I asked, est-ce que c'est un petit Suisse ou une petite Suisse? They told me the correct answer, and I'd already forgotten it by the next time. But it didn't matter. So ci and la are added to celui, celle, ce, and celle with an S when choosing between a set of options. Earlier, in the first part, we saw celui de gauche, celui de gauche. The position gauche was added as a way to decide between two options. But if you can easily identify the one you want, such as by pointing, often you'll just use ci and là, because it's rude just to point, right? You want to say something. So now that you know the difference between celui, celle, and CEUX, and celle with an S, I imagine you don't need me to tell you a lot about the difference between, for example, celui-là and ceux-là. Yeah, imagine you are asking for a couple of loaves of bread and there are two or more types. The baker might ask you, deux de ceci ou de cela. Deux de ceci ou deux de cela. And you respond accordingly. If there are more than two types, I think they just repeat la. Just like in English, you'd say one of these or one of those. But you could also feel, depending on the context and situation, that one of these or one of these. I've heard that before for sure, and it hasn't sounded strange at all. So the exact combination for each situation can't be explained in a video. You simply need to expose yourself to the language over and over and over and over, and gradually you'll be able to intuitively choose the most natural wording. But that's it. Essentially, it's ci and là, which are added to specify a choice between multiple possibilities. Now, I want to just give you some quick tips for real life usage based on my own experience with these pronouns. And I'm definitely keen to know your own opinions and experiences, whether you are a non-native like me or you are a native speaker. Please do feel free to leave it down in the comments. First of all, pronunciation of celui. Celui. When you hear it said slow, it sounds just like that. Celui. In fact, for me, ce is pronounced the same as CEUX, C-E-U-X. Natives, please do correct me if there is indeed a subtle difference, but I can't hear it. But when spoken quickly, celui becomes more like celui, celui, celui. It takes some practice to be able to adopt that yourself, but you don't actually need to. You can say it celui and it's perfectly fine. But I just want you to be aware of it for when you're hearing it, so you can actually comprehend and adequately respond. Celui. My second observation is that, again, in my experience, celui-là and celle-là are used far more than their ci counterparts. I believe this is partly because it's simply more common in life to talk about single units of things rather than multiples, so instead of the ceux-là and celle-là with the S, but also partly because the choice of options is implicit. In other words, the words celui-là and celui-ci are not said out loud, and you just end up saying this one, that one, without thinking, like you would do it in English. And là has simply become the favoured choice. So when you're in a shop and you need to just say something without going through all the rules in your head, you're statistically more likely to be right with celui-là than celui-ci, and celle-là than celle-ci. And if you're not sure about the gender, remember, just pick one, you know. I think I hear celui far more often, but again, I'm keen to know if this is a shared experience or whether this is just me. Voilà, let's do a quick recap. Celui and celle can mean the one or that of. Ce and celle with an S can mean the ones or those of, depending on the sentence. All four of these are pronouns that replace nouns in order to avoid repetition. Celui-ci, celui-là, and all the rest with those suffixes ci and là are to distinguish one individual or one group of objects or people from another set of objects or people. It's the French of this one and these ones and those ones, and which one you choose for the exact situation will depend on the situation. I hear celui-là far more often than the others. Please do tell me your experience in the comments. And celui at real speed often sounds like celui, celui. Now you know how to use these pronouns with more confidence. I highly recommend you actively use it in the next few minutes so you give yourself the best chance of retaining it compared to if you simply passively consumed the video. So here's le petit quiz du jour. Answer the questions in the comments and I'll do my best to review each response. Number 1, translate the following to French. I want the one that you had yesterday. And here the one is a masculine noun. Number 2, translate the following to English. Il écrit à celle qu'il a rencontrée en vacances. Il écrit à celle qu'il a rencontrée en vacances. And number 3 is, what can we deduce about the nouns in the following sentence? Est-ce que tu préfères celle-ci ou celle-là? Est-ce que tu préfères celle-ci ou celle-là? I look forward to reading your answers in the comments down below. While you wait for me to review them, please do leave a like on the video. It helps me more than you know. And please do check out the Confident French Speaker community via a link in the description if you're struggling to make yourself speak, first and foremost, and also to make the progress that you want to make. Merci beaucoup d'avoir regardé. À la prochaine francophone. Ciao, ciao.